आज की डे की corresponding डिस्कस करूँगा. इट्स फॉर जे एडवांस्ड फिजिक्स and topic here is electrical resistances. The purpose behind this pattern is that when you directly solve a problem asked in JEE Advanced Physics, then generally if the question is multi-conceptual, or if you have not practiced in the form of a pattern, so you will take time to analyze the problem because you have not practiced in a you can say the pattern based question in which you have to solve a particular problem in a limited time, and for that you need to use multiple parts of the brain, vary the brainwave frequencies, and that is something called as called as the brainwave frequency modulation, which is the core concept that why everybody is not able to crack JEE NEET. So when you solve a particular problem, you need to be adaptive to the high frequency modulation environment, and that cannot be learned in a single day. It requires a certain minimum time, it requires patience, because so many things are happening within you. When you are solving a particular problem, then the first thing is you need to be focused for a certain duration. Then is you need to retain information related to that problem within a very short span of time. Then you need to analyze the concept behind the problem. Then you need to comprehend it. Then you have to design the solution. So many things are concerned, many things are taking place, many processes are taking place inside your mind brain system. And generally it's not possible to manage all the processes at the very first step. So you have to train your mind brain system for learning the art of brainwave frequency modulation. So this is the concept behind the problem pattern for the various topics. We can choose any topic. The process mind brain system follows the same process. So let's see the question first. So the question is very simple, that we have two resistances R1 and R2. Coefficient of thermal resistance, coefficient of resistances are alpha 1 and alpha 2 for these two, and there is a constant source of voltage E, and the current in the circuit is I. So these resistances R1 R2 are at T1 degree centigrade. Now are there 9 questions based on this situation. I hope you get the situation right now. The first question is, let's begin with very simple things. The first is R equivalent at T1 degree centigrade. So as we know that both of resistances are in series, so certainly here R equivalent will be R1 plus R2. There is no very high thinking involved over it. It's a very simple question. Based on this, we have another question, that current at T1. So certainly current at T1 will be voltage, which is E here, divided by R1, R equivalent, which is R1 plus R2 over here. So no big deal, you can simply say this. Third question is a bit complex, not that complex, but a bit complex. You need to find potential drop across the first resistance at T1. So using Ohm's law, we can say that V1 will be I into R1. I here is E divided by R1 plus R2 into R1. From till this point, the question is very simple. Now let us make it complex. Let's induce certain analysis and the graphical analysis on this. So the question is, if somebody asks you that how will be the graph of V1 versus E, given that R1, R2 are constant. So certainly we can analyze that V1 is proportional to E. So certainly the graph will be a straight line. No, big deal in that. Now, there is another question, that how will be V1 versus R1 graph. So if we analyze the relation, R1 is here also, R1 is here also, and R2 is here also. So it cannot be straight line because we have R1 plus R2 over here and over here also. So this is not a standard curve. We need to analyze this. What we can say by analyzing this is that if R1 is 0, certainly V1 will be 0. That means graph will pass through the origin, the first thing. And second thing is, if R1 tends to infinity, so this R1 plus R2 will tends to 1, because R2 will be negligible in comparison to R1. So V1 will tend to E. So graph will be like initially it will pass through the origin, and after a long time when R1 tends to infinity, V1 tends to E, or we can say that the line from E axis, cutting the point at E axis, and parallel to R1 will be a will be horizontal asymptote to the curve. So using this trick, we can say that graph will be like this. Initially, it will be 0, and when R1 tends to infinity, it will approach to E. So that corresponds to the case that when you take R1 as too high, so certainly V1 will tends to E. As now analyze it in terms of physically. Suppose you made R1 very large. So what will happen that most of the potential will get dropped over here. So you can match up things that how physically things are happening. So suppose EMF will provide force or energy to the electrons, but here R1 tends to infinity, so it will not let the electrons to move from here to here. It will absorb most of their energy. That explains that how physically things are happening. So certainly V will be tends to E because it will absorb most of the energy, all the energy in fact, not most of the. So this is the analysis. Now there is another interesting question. How will be the graph of V1 versus R2? So we analyze the relation that R2 is here, and we can obviously say that it is in a way inversely related to R2 because R1 plus R2 can be taken as R2 dash. So we have basically a shifted coordinate system, but the shape will be a rectangular hyperbola, as is the case for inverse relation, the graphical equations. So if R2 is 0, V1 will be E. That means initially it will be E, and we can see that if R2 increases, V1 will decrease, and if R2 tends to infinity, then V1 will tend to 0. So it will be like this, and it will be a rectangular hyperbola. So this is generally not, it's not a standard curve, it's not known to everybody, so it's a special graph you can say out. So this is how we can analyze the variation of V1 versus E versus R1 versus R2. So this thing I was talking about the problem pattern based questions, because when you start solving a problem and you do the permutation and combination, so there is a certain system developing inside you which is about learning instantly. Well, you see, learning starts from the womb and it goes to the tomb. So the entire pattern behind problem pattern is to learn new problems in the same question, so that you can achieve maxima of performance. Because if you are not able to think instantly, then you cannot perform in exams so well, because it's all the game of instantaneous performance. How your mind brain system retains information or the patterns which you learned during 2 or 3 years. So that's why studying in a pattern base is always useful to you. Now let's move on to the next question. Next we have V2 at T1 degree. So obviously V2 can be written as applying Ohm's law, that I into R2. So it will be E R2 by R1 plus R2. So its analysis is same as that of V1. So I'm just omitting that. Only the names will change, shapes will be remain the same. Now coming to the next question, which is power given by the battery at T1 degree centigrade. So this is also not so complex. We know that power by the battery will be EMF square by R equivalent. So that will be E square by R1 plus R2. No big deal in this question also. It's very simple. Yes, one thing somebody can ask, that if we analyze it, if somebody asks you what is graph between P and E. So as we can see that power is proportional to E square. So the graph is gonna be a parabola over here. And it will be like this. So that will be parabola. Secondly, if we have P versus E square graph. So P proportional to E square. That means graph will be again a straight line. That will be a straight line graph. And if we draw graph between P and R1 or R2, both will be will be rectangular hyperbola. So if we draw the graph between P and R1, it will be a rectangular hyperbola like this. At infinity, it will tend to 0, and if R1 is 0, it will tend to E square by R2. So this is how we can analyze the situation. Now, there is another question 6. It says that conditions for which I is independent of temperature. Now, why this concept of temperature? So I we have calculated as is E divided by R1 plus R2. So what is relation of this equation with temperature? Thing here is that R1 and R2 are temperature set T1. So when we increase temperature, R1 R2 will change. So I will also change. Now we want that I should be independent of temperature. I mean, it should remain the same, or with respect to temperature, it should be independent. So we can intuitively say that I here is, let's analyze this. So I here is E by R1 plus R2. E does not depend on temperature. That means if by some mechanism we can make R1 plus R2 to be independent of temperature, then a task will be done. So the task here is that R1 plus R2, this should be independent of temperature. This is the new concept on which we are working. Now this is independent of temperature. So let's analyze that at certain other temperature, R equivalent becomes R equivalent dash. So we can write R equivalent dash as R1 dash plus R2 dash. I assume that R1 becomes R1 dash and R2 becomes R2 dash. Now R1 dash can be written as R1 1 plus alpha 1 delta T, and R2 dash can be written as R2 1 plus alpha 2 delta T. Now this can be written as R1 plus R2 plus delta Now here this term is independent of delta t, but here we have delta t, and here we have alpha 1 r1 plus alpha 2 r2. So if delta t is non-zero, then certainly the entire function will be dependent on delta t, but it is multiplied by alpha 1 r1 plus alpha 2 r2. Now think that is there some number which if multiplied by any other number make it constant? Yes, it is 0. You multiply 0 by any number, it will be 0, it will not change. And that is the concept over here, that just make this thing 0. 0 multiplied by anything is 0, and 0 is a constant. So that is concept involved over here. So the trick here is that alpha 1 r1 plus alpha 2 r2 should be equal to 0, which further reduces to alpha 1 r1 is minus alpha 2 r2, which reduces to r1 by r2 is minus of alpha 2 by alpha 1. So from here we can analyze that the first thing is resistances are always positive, so r1 r2 is positive. That means minus of alpha 2 by alpha 1 is positive, which further implies alpha 2 alpha 1 should be negative, which further implies that alpha 1 alpha 2 should have opposite sign. This is only possible if alpha 1 and alpha 2 have opposite sign. Fun thing. Another thing of analysis is that if we take the magnitude of R1 by R2, that will be mod of alpha 2 by alpha 1. So we can say that if R1 is greater than R2, then alpha 2 will be greater than alpha 1. And if R1 is less than R2, then alpha 2 will have to be less than alpha 1 for this condition. So we can say that larger resistance should have smaller alpha for this equation to hold good. So this is the condition for which I is independent of temperature. Now let's discuss another question, that percentage change in current when T1 is increased by 10%. So percentage change we have to find. So we can say that I dash will be E divided by R1 plus R2 plus delta T into alpha 1, yes, plus alpha 2. Obviously here is R1 alpha 1 plus R2 alpha 2. This is my new I dash. So percentage change in, we need to find I dash minus I upon I into 100. This will be the my final expression, which reduces to I dash by I minus 1 into 100. Now I dash by I will be inversely related to the resistance. So I can write it as R1 plus R2 upon R1 plus R2 plus delta T, alpha 1 R1 plus alpha 2 R2 into 100. Now delta T, I can say that it will be 0.1 times of T1. So we have the percentage change as R1 plus R2 into 100 divided by R1 plus R2 plus 0.1 T1, alpha 1 R1 plus alpha 2 R2. So this will be the final answer that we have. That finally, this much will be the percentage change in current. Now is another question, percentage change in V1. So we can say that V1 is I into R1. So we can say V1 dash will be I dash into R1. So V1 dash minus V1 by V1 into 100 is the thing we are searching for. And that will be V1 dash by V1 minus 1 into 100. And since resistance is constant, so V1 dash by V1 can be written as I1. Let's say I dash by I minus 1 into 100. So you see it will remain the same. So it will be same as that of this expression. So both expressions will be same. So it will be having the same percentage error. Now the last question is percentage change in battery, power given by battery. So here also we can say that power is, initially it will be E square by R1 plus R2. Finally it will be E square by R1 plus R2 plus delta T, alpha 1 R1 plus alpha 2 R2. So we can say that P dash by P minus 1 into 100 is what we desire. And that will be certainly P dash by P can be written as R1 plus R2 plus delta T, alpha 1 R1 plus alpha 2 R2 divided by R1 plus R2 minus 1 into 100. Yes, so that will be, and finally delta T will be 0.1 into T1. So that will be the final estimate of this, and in this way you can see that it's just inverse of this thing. Yes, so it's ultimately these are related. There will be certain relation based on percentage change in power and percentage change in current, that I leave as an exercise to you. So the point of today's discussion was about problem pattern for J advanced physics especially. So if you are not comfortable in solving advanced physics questions, you feel confusion, anxiety, depression, you are unable to bear the pressure of higher critical thinking skill questions based in physics for JE Advanced, especially for JE Advanced. So the reason being that your mind-brain system is yet not adaptive to the high frequency needed for solving or cracking a good question based in JE Advanced, as you must have seen. Because we started with a very simple question, then we increased the complexity, and the last question was the most complex. Obviously it involved calculations also, analysis, anything. So it's just like when we increase the complexity, lesser will be the number of students who will be able to manage themselves and especially their emotions. So cracking JE NEET is not only about studying physics and being a good, being a good physicist. It's about how you manage your emotions also while solving a complex problem. Because when you will solve a complex problem, multiple parts of the brain gets activated, multiple processes starts acting within you. And if you are not able to manage all the processes in series, focusing on, suppose there are 9 processes, so generally what happens is human mind system is not capable to parallel process. It can process things only in series, otherwise you will not be able to focus. So here is the game changer. Suppose there are 9 tasks involved in a particular question, so you cannot process them parallelly. So how you process? You should process with step 1, step 2, step 3 up to step 9. So those parallel processes have to be converted into series, and your focus should be on each series process. And that is something which you cannot learn by just solving the questions. I mean, just using the subject knowledge. I should be appropriate over here. Just using the subject knowledge, you have to deal with the exact mind brain algorithms, that what is the actual issue, so that you train yourself accordingly. And you must have felt yourself. When I started with question number 1, it was very easy. Then two, a bit complex, then a bit complex, then a bit complex, until we move to the last, especially the analysis of the graphs, especially the rectangular hyperbola graphs and power graphs. These were the most complex. So thing is that her mind brain system is a system itself. It's an information processing system, and the most fundamental information processing system, because whatever you see in the world that is man-made is because of the endeavors of some mind brain systems who were able to solve complex things, who were able to resolve problem which can't be solved by everybody. So it goes like this. So if you want to crack advance, especially the advanced exam, then first of all is develop your mind brain system so that you can perform in them. Reality is that most of the students, they were not able to manage their mind brain system. They were not able to manage their mind brain system. The question of some use, and that will make work. So please solve a problem. Accuracy, problem solving skills, how to get rid of negative emotions which arises when you solve complex questions, when you are not getting marks, when you are unable to solve questions. You can refer to my book OST by Acharya Vishvendra. It's available on Amazon, Flipkart, and Ocean Press. So you can use it out and certainly improve your mind brain system. I hope it works for you. Thank you and have a nice day.